Hello everybody, this is Odd Job Entertainment bringing you another video, and I'm going to say something pretty obvious but underrated, and that is that games have rules. Even when the promise is that you can do whatever you imagine, the rules provide critical structure to shape the experience.
That isn't just a backdrop. That moon is actually there orbiting the planet. Yes, you can visit it too.
For example, Halo 3, which is so loved for its sandbox, has the energy sword. It's a one-hit melee kill with impressive range for lunging. In almost all cases, when you see that red reticle, it's pretty much a guaranteed kill. Except for a few key exceptions. So what about when the other player also has an energy sword? If the inputs to strike come at the same time, rather than an instant kill, or both of you dying, or the player with a single millisecond advantage taking the win, the game has rules that dictate that if the inputs fall within some margin of error, then both players lose their shields and bounce off each other. Then you have the classic sword bans until one player is either too quick or too slow and misses the window to strike again. Another exception is the classic shotgun. If your reflexes are fast enough, you can save yourself even if their animation has already started. You can even get the Bull True medal as recognition of your cat-like reflexes. If the sword were simply a guaranteed kill, it would lose so much of what makes it special. So even with a wide sandbox, you need rules to keep things fun. Star Citizen likewise has a very large sandbox, and I'd argue that right now the game struggles to define and enforce its rule set because the sandbox has gotten too big for the mechanics in play. We can split the universe of Star Citizen into a few arenas. We have FPS, the wider ground arena, aerial, and space. And we can look at them like layers of an onion. As a game developer, it's important to define and control how these layers are allowed to interact with each other. To put a point on this, if I can fire on enemies from the safety of my Gladius cockpit, why would I ever leave and endanger myself to take on NPCs on foot? In fact, we can see that they thought about this with the larger Siege of Orison event. The only way you can access the arena is via the hover train. If you approach in a ship before the IFFI is taken down, you will get shot down. Those turrets mean business. But the smaller Orison raid missions do suffer from exactly the issue just outlined. You do eventually have to disembark to handle the enemies inside the building, but you can dispatch the majority from perfect safety. Using our diagram from before, we have aerial combat, in this case, crossing all the way to FPS combat. The question is that acceptable, and does it represent the best experience for the player? I think this example is relatively harmless, and you can make arguments in either direction. But is it the intended way to tackle these missions? Probably not. So as a developer, what tools do you have to enforce particular experiences when it's more important? For all its faults, Battlefield 2042 is a great place to start this analysis because its rocky development serves as a great illustration of what an impact these ideas can make. When it was first released, Battlefield 2042 was really banking on 128 players as a primary feature. Unfortunately, the maps were designed to provide space for 128 players, but failed to give all those players the correct kind of spaces for gameplay. The maps were dominated by massive, uninterrupted sightlines and barren areas that meant snipers and ground vehicles were constantly mopping up anyone attempting to cross these various no man's lands. This eventually led to the developers dramatically altering the maps across the board to bring firefights closer together and provide more cover opportunities to players on foot. Now, it's not perfect, but the maps today are a marked improvement compared to release. We now have much better defined vehicle areas and infantry areas, and a significant increase in usable cover. This means that players can still hoof it on foot and run into vehicles and have to combat them, but they now have much more opportunities to get to cover and hide, and move up on objectives without being exposed the entire way. With these objectives being pulled tighter, the game feels less like a walking simulator with headshots and more like a Battlefield game. Star Citizen currently faces a similar issue. If you look back at our onion, try to think about what scenarios you would want to use each one. For instance, under what condition would you use a ground vehicle that you wouldn't just use a ship? And as you may see, that's the issue. As of yet, there isn't a scenario. In fact, even FPS gameplay only currently exists because we have caves and small enclosed spaces, but there's not many scenarios in which being on foot gives you a real advantage otherwise. My observation is that Star Citizen currently employs two main methods for controlling what transport options are available to players. No-fly zones and caves, or we can call it small spaces. We've got bunkers for FPS combat, we will have distro centers that include large underground sections, and at Orison and at wreck sites, the primary motivator to leave your ship is that the NPCs will be in areas that your ship guns cannot hit. So I think there's a lot of room for expansion in this toolset, and giving more variety will benefit players by giving more focused experiences that you would otherwise miss out on. We need ways to both limit what options are available to players, and ways to encourage one behavior over another. Starting with placing limitations, let's look at ways to enhance those no-fly zones. Players don't like hard zones that don't have any freedom. So what about ways to have a no-fly zone, but fit it into the context of the story and provide more variety? We can add a number of environmental hazards. What if an electrical storm is in the area that prevents ships from being used? The player may chance some flight in this area, but with the high likelihood that they get struck by lightning that can either disable the ship or destroy it entirely, survival is a possibility, but you'll likely drop like a rock if you're hanging around too long. But just as being closer to the ground is safer in lightning storms here on Earth than it is to be higher up, maybe ground vehicles are totally fine in these scenarios. This kind of storm could be spawned whenever you need a player to land at a location and then stay there until they finish some activity, duration of time, or something along that nature. Another option in the same vein would be a scattering of anti-air towers. Think of Top Gun Maverick, where they're having to stay below a very restrictive flight ceiling. You can have players land in a designated area, safe from the turrets, so long as they adhere to a flight path, and then the larger connecting town, outpost, or city is monitored by those turrets. Your options are limited at that point to again be on foot or in a ground vehicle. And so far, these two options leave ground vehicles and foot traffic as an option together while stripping away aerial and space travel. If you want to further split them up, these or other methods of limitation are going to be important if we are to either have ground or FPS activities occurring anywhere besides underground. And we can further limit players by stripping part of the ground equation as well. If, for instance, you want the player to be only on foot, try adding mud and tar pits that swallow anything over a certain weight limit. You can even just make the terrain incompatible like we see with the increased FPS cover in Battlefield 2042. If the largest path is smaller than your vehicle clearance, and then you've already stripped air travel by some other means, now you've got your players forced to be on foot. Going the other way, supposing you want to keep players in a ground vehicle, you can have something like mustard gas in the air that hurts players. The radiation that we saw in CitizenCon, that's going to be added and probably has a similar effect. With such a wide variety of possible outer space environments, there's all kinds of noxious fumes and environmental hazards that could be implemented to control engagements. Aerial and space limitations are pretty obvious. If your target is in the air, it's probably best to also be in the air. Same obviously goes for space. I don't think people really wonder where space vehicles make the most sense. The problem right now is that they make too much sense in all areas. As for the second half of this conversation, we need some things to be added to incentivize one style of gameplay over another. In the most recent Star Citizen Live, there were mentions of a lot of what I'm about to describe, so we know that it's at least something CIG is aware of. Top of the list is roads. Comfortable, wide, flat stretches that are easy to navigate in a ground vehicle connecting two locations to each other. Going along with this, you need distances that would suck to cover on foot and locations close enough that ground vehicles make sense. This could be two distro centers or outposts, towns, settlements. Whatever the case may be, you need two high-value areas connected by an easy traversal method. I also think it would be good to have something akin to a rideshare connecting these locations as well as their intra-connections. They don't need to be fancy, and you'd need a way to prevent players from just stealing them outright. That's not that hard to do though. Just put those wheel locks like they have at Walmart to render them unusable outside the 3D volume that they're allowed in. And physical obstructions are another method that are surprisingly not really used that much yet. The majority of airspace between buildings and Star Citizen are wide enough to accommodate at least fighters and often even something as big as an 890J. In the real world, how often would a private jet fit between buildings? Helicopters do fare much better in cities, but planes, arguably the better and more direct analog for our ships, are really going to struggle. Having points of interest at ground level surrounded by other buildings or complex terrain is a great way to push players into walking or driving. And the great part of all of these is that you can push players toward one method or another, and none of them are limited to being underground. This enables more FPS missions above ground and experiences that we don't currently have access to yet. But the real major benefit of all this is that, yes, it does place limitations on players, but it does so in a way that they'll be happy about. Invisible walls are terrible. Hard and fast no-goes, they suck. But needing to stay in your Ursa because there's a cloud of irradiated gas in the area, that's a puzzle. That's gameplay. We often think that we want total freedom in games, but that's not really the case. As players, we want puzzles and challenges and the freedom to solve them. So the presentation is different here. Imagine you need to get from point A to point B, but there's 10 kilometers of distance and a violent windstorm between here and there. The obvious answer is to take a grav cycle or some ground vehicle. But this all happens in the context of the game, and this is the natural conclusion reached by the player. So you have effectively placed limitations on the player, but it comes in the form of gameplay they wouldn't have otherwise. This psychological trick means the player enjoys the experience and feels like they're the one coming up with the solutions. In a game with so much in the way of cinematic experiences on offer, this is vital. Take Squadron 42 for example. If you've done all this work to do motion capture with the Mark Hamill, you want every player to see that performance, right? So if there's a conversation on board the Idris that you can bypass accidentally by flying by in your ship, that's literally a lost investment. You need to make sure the player lands in the Idris, walks to the war room, and witnesses the scene. And one classic example is the Warthog run in the Halo games. Most games have one. My favorite is Halo 3, again, because that was my first Halo game, so it's special to me. The game straight up lies to you though, and makes you think that you're running short on time. But as shown in this clip by Rocket Sloth, you can actually do it all on foot. With all the enemies and the shaking screen and stuff blowing up though, you probably never even realized that was an option. But this perfectly encapsulates everything we've been talking about. The developers successfully stripped players of the massive Halo 3 sandbox for a brief time and corralled them into a one-of-a-kind cinematic race against time. Ultimately, if you're going to lovingly craft massive experiences for players, sometimes it means taking things away for their own good. But we've talked about a lot so far. All of it centers around how and when players engage in each kind of arena. And the methods described here aim to add more variety and gameplay and freedom options to players by restricting their actions. Bit of a paradox, but I hope you can see now how we arrived at that conclusion. Quick shout out to our top members, well, member at the moment, John Best. Orbital Bombardier tiers and higher gets you a recurring mention in each subsequent video. Your support helps me afford to make these videos and ensure that I will be able to continue growing and improving as a creator. Now I turn it to you. What do you think? What are some other methods of limiting players as described here? And is there something I missed? Like, share, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, this is Oddjob Entertainment, signing off.